I was out on the long road when the ute died for good. It coughed once and then stopped, and I sat with the motor ticking like a pocket watch going dead. The red sun scraped the horizon. A tin billy sat on the seat beside me, and there was no fresh water in the whole cab. Dust hung in the air like a promise of nothing. I remembered the tin cold against my palm, and the dent where the rope had hit it. I remember a ridiculous, specific memory of black ants chewing at the edge of a camping plate at a roadside tea 5 years earlier. That memory kept coming back. Small, edible things that tasted of the bush. Of course I had no water. Of course I had a tin billy. The radio was flat, and the ute's tailgate sagged. I had a mate who'd walked off with a spanner, and the sense that I'd made a mistake that would live inside me. I'd been a camel hunter since the first winter after I left home. In 2015, my life was the long grind of station work and camel runs. Spotter on a ridge, a headlamp at night, the slow patience of keeping a dog steady until the right camel eased into range. We did the work the family business sent us to do. My brother ran the books from the homestead and kept the paperwork tied to our name. He liked order and numbers. I liked roads that dissolved into red and heat shimmer. We kept things between us mostly by habit and the tacit rules of the job. Take the ute, check the station fridge, don't drive too up at night if the track goes thin. But habit doesn't make you infallible. The ute was a ruddy old Ford they'd let me use because I could fix things that needed mending. I could sleep in the back on nights when the station had a run to town. It had a roof rack with a spare wheel and 2 jerry cans. One jerry had a strip of duct tape across a seam. The latter rattled. The driver's seat had a hole in the foam. The tailgate latch stuck unless you hit it just right. It had personality and it had a temper. I should have guessed the temper would show when I was alone. I was out with Mick that week. Mick had been on the station since he was too young to be trusted with more than a shovel. He had hands like potted tree roots, and a grin that looked like it might go to pieces. He knew the Northwest tracks and could think in the slow arithmetic of animals. We made a good pair because our mistakes canceled each other out. He'd notice if I left a pack behind. I'd notice if he had forgotten to strap the rifle boot down. We ran camels through a patch of Simpsons some maps pretended was empty. The contract came from my brother's insistence that we needed to keep the numbers down. On the road, the numbers were animals, and the stakes were the station's bottom line. And whatever pride my brother thought was his also rode in the tray. Being alone in that part of the Simpson is a bet against a long list of things with teeth. Heat, the road that vanished into gibber, a truck on the wrong side of the dust. You inherit poor luck the moment your ute starts to cough. We'd been moving a mob off the 7-mile sand plain. The camels had hung around a dry soak that still tasted of water if you dug at the right spot. The topsoil, though, only held a memory. We picked the camels, shot the improved ones, and left the mares that wouldn't fetch freight. The sun that day pushed and polished the road into a bright line. We had a thermos and 2 tins of stew and some careless jokes about who would drive the old ute home if it started playing up. We should have taken the spare jerry and checked the radiator one more time. We didn't. The ute made a noise like a throat catching on sand 30 clicks from the bore. It coughed and smoke hovered under the bonnet like a confused animal. Mick killed the ignition, put a hand on the engine and waved me back because his hand trembled. You don't wave a hand like that unless you're close to losing a part of yourself. He looked at the dash, the temp needle levitating like a small bird. He pushed the bonnet up and went to the spare wheel to look for a screwdriver. The stopgap was simple: an inline pump, a hose, a couple of clamps. It was the kind of fix you can do when the nearest workshop is a tank of diesel and a decision. He walked off toward the scrub to see if there was wire or a twig to use as a shim, muttering about the heater hose. I should have insisted we stay together. I didn't. He said he'd be back in an hour, and I believed him. Part of believing was ego. I'd driven this road since I was a kid and I'd slept through worse. Part of believing was the job. We had a timetable to keep and a list of calls to make. My brother would have wanted the day done. He drove home like a man with a ledger. I wanted the day done, because the sooner we finished, the less likely I was to get a call about a missed run. So I sat in the shade of the cab with the tin billy and the keys in the ignition, and I watched the road swallow Mick's silhouette. There were small mistakes that day, the kind that feel stupid only after you taste the consequence. We had one full jerry and the other half full, and I had left the water for domestic things in the back instead of up top. The radio aerial had a crack I thought I could live with. The map in the glove box was folded the wrong way, so I couldn't find the track at a glance. I didn't lock the bonnet properly. A small stone had lodged and the clamp hadn't seated. The straps on the roof rack were hand loose, and the boot lid had a soft hinge. The billy was dented and tasted of old tea scum. I'd used it for coffee that morning, not water. Any one of those things wouldn't have mattered if Mick hadn't gone off. But mistakes compound the moment you put a man in a place where he must make a duress decision. Mick walked off for an hour. Later I heard the engine cough once like a warning. When the heat took his shape, I realized he hadn't come back. I called out. The heat drank my voice. The desert eats messages slowly and spits them out in another shape. I watched where he'd gone, the plane of his shoulders and the way the scrub swallowed him. I thought he'd found someone or something useful. I thought he'd be back with a grin and a piece of metal that would make the engine cough one more warm breath and go on. He didn't. The radiator gave up with a simple betrayal. A hairline crack had opened near the top tank. A seam in the heater hose we'd ignored started to leak in earnest. Coolant oozed onto the sand in a tiny oily crescent, and the motor cooled with the indifference of iron. I could have closed the bonnet, unlocked the roof rack and walked to the bore with a canteen and an old hat. I could have walked until my mouth tasted like dust and hope. I stayed. Call it stubbornness or the ledger's pressure. I thought staying would be better because Mick would return. I thought the ute would temper its complaint with a cough, some forgiveness. I was wrong. What I felt wasn't reason. It was reaction to that ledger my brother kept and the place I had in it. Go home with the mob, he'd have said. Don't make waves. But I was still young enough to trust a promise and old enough to believe a routine. The sun moved like a slow grievance. I kept the billy close. The first hours passed in a hush that felt bigger than the day. You don't notice heat when it starts. You notice the small things it steals. My mouth took on the dryness of a book. The flies grew bold and decorative. The billy offered only the memory of coffee. A ring of metallic taste and old tea scum rubbed against my gums like grit. My water bottle, the soft plastic one for short trips, sat half buried under a tarp in the back. It had a patched seam and there was no water in it long before the engine failed. I realized I'd made the classic choice. Solvency of convenience over solidity of preparation. My brother's edit would have been merciless. The first black ants appeared at the lip of the tailgate. Small black lines, like someone dragging a soft pencil across dust. They swept crumbs from our lunch packet and moved with the economy of a cartographer. They were the sort of ants that gather in a serious, effective way. I watched them for a long time the way you watch a slow hand you can't meet. The ants looked like stitches and like instruction. It was late and I had nothing else to do. Waiting becomes work when the stakes are the same as your head. I rolled my shoulder, looked at the tin billy, then at the ants. They were the only living thing that had water. Desperation rearranges rules. I had eaten worse things in the heat than ants. Old biscuit crumbs and film from a can of stew. But I'd never eaten ants as a deliberate act of survival. I scooped one onto my tongue with the back of a molar and felt movement there. The legs, the little pulse, and a sharp lemon tang. It tasted of citrus and the sterile bite of formic acid. That first bite was a small moral event. Degradation and salvage at once. We kill camels to manage stock. eating ants felt like a low-level theft from the landscape. The taste wasn't the point. The taste made my mouth fill with the idea of moisture. There are ways a man learns to use small things. My first method was crude. Gather a line of ants on my palm, fold my hand, press until they failed, and suck the paste the bodies made. It was not pretty. Ants pop when pressed, and the fluid inside is minimal, but it felt like something because my saliva mixed with it and made it go down. There's a physiology to the mouth that can be trained to save water. You swallow less, breathe through your nose, and keep your tongue to the roof of your mouth. The ants gave me something to chew, and that kept me from drinking my own spit. Their formic acid burned at the edges of taste and made my head clear for a minute. If you've ever sucked on a plaster to stay awake, you know that sharp, necessary feeling. Economy followed. I noticed ants moved to certain plants that secreted nectar under the leaf. The ants returned fatter with shiny abdomens. Shiny ants tasted more like water. I learned to follow the lines and find the leavings. Small flowers on creosote and wax plants exuded sap the insects loved. I held my palm beneath a fine leaf, let the ants climb on, and then mashed them into paste. Sometimes the paste clumped with yellow resin the ants brought, and that resin was like sugar. You don't chew ants for calories. You chew them for moisture and for the routine they bought you. Chewing kept me occupied and kept panic at bay. On the first night I slept in the back of the ute with the tin billy at my feet and rationed the ants by portion. The billy became a crude pantry for ant pastes. I scraped and licked the bowl clean. There was an intimacy to eating live things this small. I knew the root of the antline by the gloss on their bodies. I could read a colony's mood by pace and size of recruits. When they moved diplomatic, they hauled a known treasure. When they moved frantic, they'd found something new and risked everything to carry it back. I mashed the fat ants and waited for the juice and the small relief that was not water, but a way to keep the head steady. There is a practical cruelty to the act. Ants bite, and some pheromones made my nose ache. I learned to cup them and use the shadow of my other hand to herd the line. You can teach an ant where you want it to go with the right pressure. The ritual felt ridiculous, a grown hunter co-opting insect labor, but it became an instruction manual. Watch, wait, gather, press, chew, conserve, repeat. Those words were not elegant, but they were efficient. By the end of the second day, my tongue had a new memory. Acid, resin, and faint plant sugars converted through insect living. I realized I was learning a language the desert spoke to those who listened. Ants were adapters between plant and sun, tiny bladders of life when larger things were absent. I didn't celebrate. I didn't want to imagine telling my brother he would call me reckless, and that would be the end of the conversation. In his ledger, my survival was an item, not an epic. Still, it worked in a brutal, specific way. I lasted longer on their juice than I expected. The ants didn't replace water, but they slowed the body's betrayal. Every lick of ant past saved a swallow of saliva. Every conserved swallow delayed the day heat opened a cavity in my skull and hollowed my decision-making. The billy was useless for water, but a box full of ant pulp was something to manage. The stink on my fingers made me feel like a thief, but my head cleared after each chew. In that clarity, I watched the long road for shapes. Survival isn't a romance, it's a set of trades. For me, the trade was ugly and undignified. A little life for a chance to keep mine. The ants taught patience and the value of small things. They taught that when your gear fails, the land still offers if you can read it. At dusk, I sat on the tailgate with the billy between my knees and ants braided across my palm. The light pulled the landscape into blue and shadow, and the track lost its edge. I thought of Mick walking into the scrub, and I thought of my brother at the homestead with his ledger and a cup of tea. Everything, the business, the hunting, the tracks, boiled down to tiny acts of calculation that sometimes get you wrong. I didn't yet know if I'd made the worst mistake of my life. I only knew one set of options: wait for help or test insect moisture on a walk toward the boar. For the moment, the ants were my ally. I didn't know how far that alliance would take me. Days sharpened into a small, repeating violence. Heat came like a hand closing, slow and then sudden. By noon, it had the jaw. I woke with sand in my mouth and the taste of charred metal in my gums. The ute sat hood up like a wounded animal. Smoke stains darkened the bonnet and tires were half buried in dust. There was no water, and the billy was full of ant pulp. The road ran straight and indifferent to both. I developed a routine because routines are cheap superstitions that keep you moving. At first light, I walked the track on foot. Boots kicked up ghost clouds and I searched the low scrub for black trails. The ants kept to the low places under tussocks and the edges of rabbit warrens. I learned the small physics: cup a handful without crushing them, drag a spoon along a column so the mass collects in the billy, chase the smell when the wind misdirected it. I ate them slow. That was the trick. Not to swallow whole, but to convert each insect into a small ration of moisture. I pressed them between my teeth and rolled them over my tongue until they gave up salts and oil. I licked my palm until the skin squeaked, and every swallow was a negotiation. The ants bought time. Each tiny wetness was an accounting entry. Saved saliva here, steadier pulse there. If panic ran me, I would betray myself faster. So I rationed, counting small dozens and refusing to eat until the sun softened. I drank the ant juice like a luxury spirit. Small sips, ceremonious, hoarded. The flies learned my rhythm quicker than men did. They found my face before any vehicle. Days bled together, heat, ants watching the road. I recorded nothing. My ledger was muscle memory and the slow burn of sun through my shirt. Sleep came in shallow stabs. Shadows folded across the track, and I would nod on the tailgate with the billy between my knees. I dreamt of ledger lines and my brother's thin mouth closing around a pen. In the dream, he crossed out my name, and I woke with ants still on my palm. My thinking condensed. Small practical mistakes multiplied when the head thinned. I found myself forgetting simple trades. Spanners on the passenger seat. Not covering the tank cap properly. Once I nearly jumped when I caught my shadow while collecting ants under spinifex. The heat has a way of knifing off calculus. Planning becomes guesswork. People imagine thirst is mostly the mouth. It's not. It rearranges everything inside you. Salinity creeps up. Your brain loses its edges, and routine decisions take on the weight of a first descent. My mind narrowed to an axis: ants and the road. A distant engine would make me sit up like I'd heard the station bell. Once a dust plume had me standing so fast my knees knocked, and it died to nothing. People drive past without seeing you because they're on their own lists. On the third day, a false rescue came and went. Mick returned briefly that day, dusty and apologetic, having walked, then hitched a ride and argued for a spare solenoid. He stayed long enough to try the starter and then left again to fetch a cable. He had a ruckus of apologies and blue-collar solutions that either fix a problem or create new ones. He tried the ute and swore, then told me the battery was done and the winch stripped. He said he could find a tow rope or a part if we could get to the greater 6 kilometers east. He left that afternoon to fetch a cable and a plan. He sounded certain when he went, but I was not. He clapped me on the shoulder and walked off until the scrub took him like a swallowed coin. Night was worse. The cold filled the hollows the heat had made. My lips split and oozed into the ant paste. I had small delusions. I'd wake convinced water waited in the billy. Hope tasted like ant juice and sand. On the 5th day, waiting turned dangerous. Mick's brief return had increased my need to act. A plan has an energy absence doesn't. I made the wrong calculation. A walk to the boar might increase my odds of being seen. The boar lay a long, lonely 3-hour walk east. I thought it might offer water or a message. I should have waited. I did not. I set out with a small pack and a bandana full of ant paste. Walking reduced my body to blunt furniture moving through wind. Every hill looked like a false summit. After an hour, my pace thinned, and my legs began to feel like lead. My soles heated through my boots like coals, and my breath came hot and ragged. Then the land removed certainties one by one. I misjudged a dune. My foot slid, and I went down. The bag of ants spilled. I lay with hands pressed to the ground, trying to breathe the cool of whatever shadow I had made. Panic climbed the back of my throat, and I ground it down with formal tasks. Count 10 heartbeats, name 5 things by distance, take a sip of ant paste and swallow it as medicine. The world contracted to my palm. In delirium, I imagined my brother at the homestead reading a ledger and tallying the cost of my mistakes. A small, ridiculous rage at him, and the situation fed me long enough to get to my feet. The sky blurred and colors ran together, and then a motor hummed over the flat. It was not grand. A battered Pro-Land company truck with a ute tray full of gear came into view. Mick was in the passenger seat and the foreman drove. They'd widened the search after reports the grader had passed without stopping. I must have been visible as a darker smudge against the pale. Mick swore loud and sharp, and the foreman threw the vehicle into a skid and jumped out. They found me like you find a mistake. Obvious once you know where to look. Mick's face steadied me. His anger had a nervous undertone of relief. He lifted me onto the tray and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. The foreman drove like a man pulling a rope at the end of the world. At the bore, they poured water into my mouth like an offering and an accusation. It went down hot and sour and gave me a terrible immediate clarity. There were station hands and a roadhouse man and a photographer who smelled of diesel and curiosity. My billy sat on the tray beside me, rimed with ant residue like a trophy of desperation. They were polite until the politeness ran out. First jokes to punch a space where fear should be. Then questions. Where'd you get the water? Why didn't you wait? Who else was out with you? Then the ledger question. What will this cost the operation? The foreman looked at the billy and asked, You really did stop on ants? Yes, I said. It was a fact, not a story. His eyebrows made the small negotiation men do when weighing brave against stupid. Word travels in open country. The roadhouse crowd gathered and the story spread like an ember. They called me everything from saint to lunatic. Someone hammered a notice on the post and told anyone who'd listen, Camper survived on black ants, a local legend. Curiosity followed. A man from the university came through a week later drawn by ant diet and a man surviving on insect moisture. He wanted samples and notes and took swabs from my hands with clinical interest. Someone offered me an electrolyte drink, and the idea that science could be made from humiliation and survival felt both pleasing and irksome. The fallout mixed practical consequence and pride reckoning. The station logged the incident in its book. My brother put a memo on the office bulletin. No single man to be left on track. He tightened rules because the ledger demanded it. He wanted insurance and predictability, and to salvage the station's reputation. The rule cost me autonomy. He forbade me going to the long road alone and insisted on a licensed mechanic service and a tracker fitted. The station paid for the tow and billed me in the ledger like I were part owner of a mistake. For a week I helped with fence repair and low-profile tasks to rebuild standing. The men watched me to see if I'd retreat from the hunter's road. Mick treated me differently. Less teasing, more measured watchfulness. He wouldn't forget that my misstep had become his by the margin of rescue. Mateship is not only big saves, it's long accounting. It's small favors and gestures of repair that pay for emergencies. Mick had been part of my rescue in a way both incompetent and necessary. He had left me once but returned with the spanner. There were embarrassed questions. Why didn't you wait? Why walk? Answers were thin and heavy with stubbornness. My pride was bruised in the everyday way men notice you've been lucky and not skillful. The station talk turned practical. Bring water, always. Maps were examined, and points circled with sharp ink. Someone inventoried our equipment. Survival moved from individual heroics to the dull machinery of prevention. In the weeks after, when the mark of the sun had whitened and the taste of ant pulp receded, I had time to reckon. The desert teaches if you listen. You learn to read the small things. How a storm starts, the scent of a distant vehicle, the angle a snake lies in shade. You learn pride is a bad compass. You learn that folks who keep ledgers have a kind of usefulness. I learned surviving was not an accolade but a ledger entry with a margin note. Keep account. The ants had been brutal and specific lessons in resourcefulness and small humiliation. They had kept me alive because I surrendered dignity for practicality. They taught me to value small trades. A lick of moisture for an hour of clarity. My brother's face stayed with me, not the angry one, but the quiet one after the scolding. The ledger was his way of seeing the world, and it made him good at certain things. It did not teach him the desert, and it did not teach me business. We were both right in our own economies. The episode reorganized us. He was more watchful. I was more careful about how I set out. I made a choice in the washroom with papers flat. The land had not proved false. It was coherent in its indifference. The ants had not been miraculous, only practical. The long road was still the work of my hands. I could have stayed inside the fence lines and run the books. My brother, in a way he rarely did, gave me freedom to choose. He marked me in the ledger but did not box me in, so I went back. Not defiant, but deliberate. I had new protocols, a tracker on the bonnet, an extra Jerry chained in the tray, and a radio that stayed on. I took Mick when I could, and 2 people when he couldn't go. I left with a checklist and a rewritten relationship with the ledger. I carried both my brother's scolding and his quiet hand in the doorway. People said I should stop. They thought hunting camels in The Simpsons an old man's hobby and a dangerous ledger item. But work is not only ledger lines and risk-cost analysis. For me, the land was where I could read tracks and shadows. The ants had taught me small economies. The thing I carried home was humility and a stubborn registry that I was going back. I tightened my pack differently the next time. The billy went with me as a reminder, not a container for shame. I put a small paper note inside with a mottled smear of ant residue. It was a different ledger, a small account of cost and lesson. I tapped the tin with my knuckle and looked up the long road. The sun was already up. I whooped the engine awake with a gentleness I'd learned. I hit the track not because I was reckless, but because I'd been schooled by an indifferent teacher. I knew the price of ignorance now. The tray was lighter for 1 less Jerry, but heavier for a tin that had become a map of what I'd done wrong. I had rehearsed apologies and answers, but the look my brother gave me when I climbed down from the ute mattered more than words. He didn't bend to hug me or shout. He folded his arms in the doorway and watched what I would choose to be. "You still got the billy?" he asked. It wasn't a question about metal. It was a test. I handed it over. The tin was warm from how I'd carried it. The scrap with ant residue stayed inside. He turned it in his hands as if it were a little ledger of its own. His quiet said more than scolding ever could. We'd argued about what got written and what didn't. This time the ledger was people and dust and the smell of sun on skin. "You could have been dead," he said finally. It was a statement and an account. "I know," I replied. The answer was thin and truthful. People told the story in the roadhouse where coffee tastes like diesel. They wanted the facts, how, when, and the flourish. The roadhouse owner printed a headline that made me wince. "Reg Fogarty survives on black ants without water." It carried shock and a bit of pride. I told the story slow because details were the currency I still had. I told them about the sun, the ute that quit, Mick's boots receding, and the tiny errors that turned waiting into calculus. I explained how ants were not a trick but a method and how to read the lines. Some scoffed and some nodded as if given a secret. Insurance noticed. The station's ledger gained a notation beside my name. Expeditionary risk. We argued in sterile rooms about liabilities and observers. I signed forms I could not remember filling out. Practically, the changes were small. The bonnet looked different with a tracker glued on and a chain jerry in the tray. The radio buzzed where the ashtray had been. I learned the small liturgy of checklist, radio test, jerry secure, water full. The billy stayed with me. Not hidden, not discarded as a talisman of shame. It lived in the glove box, and I touched the paper with ant smear, like a benediction. The ants had shown me moisture pooled under leaf and small creatures carrying water like shuttles. They'd taught me to notice the little movements that tell you where to place the big ones. Mick's return and his spanner shaped the way we shuffled days after. He didn't lecture. He hauled beside me until the engine coughed a sound that felt like life. There is a measurement of loyalty that doesn't announce itself. It is the man who leaves for a spare part and returns because someone else is still waiting. My brother remained the slow argument. He scolded before and after, and his ledger kept its columns. But when I asked a week later if I could check a track, he looked to see if my breathing was steady. "It's not about whether you can," he said. "It's about whether it's worth what it costs." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else. He didn't ask me to stop. He asked me to reconcile the ledger. I had a choice, and I chose to go back with new respect for the rules. I tightened straps, checked the radio, and tested the tracker. I took a friend, and I left the billy in the glove as reminder. There were nights I woke with sand behind my teeth and ants in the corner of my imagination. Those nightmares were small tutors that taught me to respect the measure of my stubbornness. Pride didn't die. It learned to ask questions first. The ledger had new columns: mitigation, new gear, second man. If you asked whether the ledger had won, I'd say it hadn't. It had only made the cost explicit, and I paid it. Extra paperwork, a new radio, and a quiet inwardness when I read the sky. The land taught a lesson I wrote on my skin. Small things rearrange the world by persistence. An ant trail told me more than a map on one afternoon. Plants held breath and root, and leaf and shade signaled where moisture sank deepest. I learned to watch the horizon for light that says where shade will be tomorrow. The learning flattened my arrogance. There was a daily practice after that. Anytime I packed the ute, I ran a checklist out loud. I might have been embarrassed if someone heard, but necessary things deserve being remembered out loud. I snapped the radio, checked the tracker, tightened the jerry, and counted canteens. I slid the billy in the glove and touched the ant smear like a small prayer. On a long morning by a dry salt pan, I opened the tin and spread the paper on my palm. The smear was a dark constellation and a measure of what I'd bartered for life. I cupped my hand and considered the ant trail that had once been my supply line. I used to think the desert asked only of strength. It does ask that, but mostly it asks you to be small enough to notice. The ants taught me that. People asked whether it changed how I felt about the work. Did the taste of ant meat make me quit? No, I returned because the work was part of who I am and because I could honor it with diligence. I came back because there were still camels to chase and tracks to read. I let others spin versions of the story, and I let the headlines have life. That gossip had a reward. Someone inspected roads with more curiosity, and the station paid more attention to equipment. My mistake rewired habits in small bureaucratic ways. My pride changed shape but did not die. I still went out hunting camels in The Simpson. I did it with humility learned from a tiny teacher. The billy stayed in the glove as a reminder. I wrote on the scrap what it costs, what it taught. One morning, months later, I stopped to check a fence line. The wind lifted sand into patterns, and I placed my palm on the hood to warm it. I dug fingers into spinifex at the verge, and black ants spilled out. They ran over my hand like a glitter of life, beautiful and ridiculous. I cupped them and let them march a living map. I remembered the taste, sharp iron, the bite of dust, and it felt like an admission. The long truth of keeping a man alive in that country is rarely a single miracle. It's 1,000 small mercies and animals that point the way. I let them scatter back to the ground and held the image. Black bodies moving across my palm, the ute like a patient animal at the road's edge. I breathed and measured the course that kept us moving. Desert, ants, the billy in the glove, the ledger in my brother's hand, and Mick's quiet presence. When I tell the story now at the roadhouse or to a camera, I do it because the lesson belongs on the record. It's not bravado, but a ledger of humility and a list of debts. Small things save you if you notice them. Mateship is the currency you pay when you're foolish. Stubbornness without respect for the country is a dangerous coin. If you find yourself on a long road and the canteens are light, look down, read the ants and check the radio. Take a man with you and keep the billy as a reminder, not a badge. Learn the little economies, the shade that hides moisture and the plant that keeps the ground damp. If this tale helped you read a road or notice the small things that keep a man alive, share it with someone who drives the long road. It might save them a mistake.